titled my presentation, California Needs Cows. I give talks not rarely, and I'm always invited to give a talk at these various agroecology classes at Berkeley or environmental classes at Berkeley. So I like to start out with a bald-faced statement that I'm fond of cattle and I think they can be a very good thing. I realize they're not perfect, neither are people, but they're really important in California for various reasons, which I'll try to convince you of. But that always gets the certain, students interested because really, in fact, my whole career has been experiencing what it means to have people biased against you. For some reason, we're trained that cows are bad now. And cows are really just something kept by people. They're not innately good or bad. They're just animals. You may not like the various production systems or something like that, but they're animals that have been with us for some 10,000 years or so and have served the needs of people in various ways. But that's been interesting to experience my whole career. But I'll get back onto the topic. What I was going to say is I'm also going to talk about sheep and goats to some extent. So grazing has long been used, and by that I mean probably about 2 or 3 decades that people notice that it's an incredibly valuable technique for managing the vegetation of California. One of you mentioned that, we have a real sort of vegetation management need in California. And indeed we do. And we need long-term vegetation management to manage, I'm focusing on fire here, wildlife risk and behavior. And we need short-term vegetation management because so much of our fuel, which is annual grass, has an annual cycle. It doesn't, something you do to it one year won't affect the next very much. Rainfall will, but not grazing. And so it has to be managed every year for the best effect. And then we need to use the right tool or combination of tools for the right goals. We need to have clear goals and objectives. And anybody who tells you this is what we need to do rotational grazing, we need to do this is going to work everywhere, they're wrong. It doesn't work everywhere. And when you talk about climax vegetation, it really depends on the soil, what it is in California. For example, that's a good example of how we need to be thinking about specific sites. And the same is true for management of vegetation. We really need to know the vegetation, the soils, the ecological site, and what its potential is. And then we need to predict the rainfall. So I'm saying that somewhat sarcastically, but what I mean is there's always going to be a big unknown in California when we manage things. And that big unknown is going to be how much is it going to rain? This year's been quite interesting, huh? So as I mentioned a few decades ago, people started to really notice that you needed grazing, people in the field. This doesn't necessarily reach the popular audience too much. It's too easy to think in terms of black and white, but actually people who work in the field trying to conserve wildlife have noticed that cattle can be very useful. And we have to remember that a cow is a human subject. So what it does is up to people. It's not something that cows thought of themselves. But before that, the question was, are cows good or are cows bad? But for people who work in the field now, okay, it's become more a question of when do we use cows and where cows? And by cows, you can take sheep and cattle in there too. I just happen to have pictures of cows. Where do we use cows and when do we use them? When is it good to use them? When do we not want to use them? All those are questions. They're up to us. They're not up to the cow, as it's a domestic animal. So this is a picture from 1875 of the California grassland in the Central Valley. And you may notice that it looks a lot like the Central Valley today. We have grass, we have these fabulous flowers that we get, we have cows, we have oaks. And in fact, this is from right around here in the East Bay. It's not that different looking, right? But in fact, at least from the late 18th century, the grassland began changing for various reasons, and it's a new grassland. It's not the same grassland. It's not a grassland that our fire regimes were created in, that Native American people created the fire regimes of California. And it's not the same as the grassland that a lot of our wildlife evolved with. And that's something that managers need to be concerned with. The grasses that dominate a lot of the grassland today came from the Fertile Crescent. And if you went to the same high school I went to, you know that the Fertile Crescent is where agriculture and cultivation was one of the places in the world where cultivation of soils began, where agriculture, uh, kind we know now, came about, and it's where a lot of animal domestication happened. And so these plants, livestock raising, and agriculture all developed together. And so the factors that really changed our grassland, they all came as part of a package. Agriculture and livestock introduced seeds, um, and agriculture, crop agriculture, introduced massive soil disturbance that made homes for seeds from the old world. And the old world plants had thousands of years to adapt to both of these things. And the climax vegetation that Bob referred to did not. It evolved with some antelope, with some elk, um, not a deer and other things, but not a whole lot, not not very much cultivation in California and not domesticated grazing animals. So what does that mean? So our grassland is referred to by ecologists as a novel ecosystem, meaning it's a combination of our plants and old world plants that is unique. And it's also pretty stable. In other words, it's going to continue to change, but actually it's pretty much here to stay for most of California's grassland. There are certain soils where a lot of restoration can be done, and a lot of soils where it's not very feasible. So we call it a novel ecosystem. It's one that we have and that we pretty much have to live with and learn how to manage. But it's new, it's still changing, and probably will change for quite a long time. And most of the plants that are here came from other ecosystems with similar climates, which includes the Mediterranean region of Europe. And in fact, our climate is called Mediterranean because it's dry summers. I mean, think about it. Our plants have to go through 8 or 9 months of drought every year. Well, 6 to 9, I guess. And then there's no snow. It's moist in the winter, irregularly, highly irregularly. Temperatures are irregular, and it seldom freezes or snows in much of our grassland at lower elevations. Even in the forest, though, of the Sierra, they still have a lot of Mediterranean characteristics. So this is, for example, why grazing has become a field person's, a manager's, in some cases, not all, uh, tool. This is Tulare Hill down near San Jose, and in 2002, this photo was taken by a fellow named Steve Weiss, who wrote some pretty interesting papers, but it was grazed at this time. You can see the native forbs poking through the annual grassland, the non-native grassland, pretty abundantly in this site, but people became concerned that grazing was having an effect on native species, maybe, so they just didn't like it, so they took it off. And what happened is this ungrazed situation where you have so much dead, I mean, annual grass or this non-native grass, that it makes it very hard for the native forbs to come up. You see poppies and dodecathyon, I forget the strong common name, but here you just have this pile of grass, and it is so thick and so dense that you've got basically one species of grass coming up through it, which is an agropyron that is rhizomatous, and that's the only thing. So you've significantly reduced the biodiversity of the habitat, and some of our wildlife don't cope well with that, including tiger salamanders, kit foxes, burrowing owls. They don't do well in this. So grazing has become something used pretty frequently for wildlife management in many cases. And I'm talking about a lot of different groups. I'm working with Fish and Wildlife on a grazing study right now that they need grazing for certain kinds of habitat needs. So it's not a rare thing. Um, So grazing, livestock grazing, this isn't a thing that eats grass, right? And sometimes shrubs. It eats stuff. So it creates shorter grass and openings where some of the native species can get through. It can change the species a little bit, not a lot, because our species are so dependent on rainfall and soils, maybe 10% influenced by grazing, and grassland structure, whether it's thatch or short, all those things, and that whether it's patchy or a monoculture. You can manage invasives or weeds if you make an effort. You can also encourage some of them. Again, all these things depend on how you graze, and you can reduce fire hazard, and that's what we're talking about today. Um, ah, Okay, so I gotta learn this. So maybe use the buttons. So Coyote Ridge, Santa Clara, that's a place that's very prominently managed by grazing because they discovered that some of the native species simply were dying out or not at least showing because of the nitrogen enhancement from the highway, if you believe that or not in particular. And so they started grazing there. Steve Weiss, who took those earlier pictures, did the research there. And now, with grazing, it can be this beautiful park with flowers, which also benefits an endangered pollinator called the bay checker spot butterfly. But also people, they like it. In fact, grazing benefits a host of wildlife for similar reasons. And I'm not going to talk about that, although I love to, because I want to concentrate on fire. But this is a Hearst ranch. It's a grazed vernal pool, which would be all grass without grazing. Okay, and there's a paper that I did with a former student of mine, came out in 2021. She reviewed 284 fish and wildlife species listings and found that 64% of the listed animals and 56% of listed plant species are reported in the Fish and Wildlife Service listing documents for the species, which states they're endangered and gives management recommendations to benefit from some kinds of grazing. And that doesn't mean any grazing anywhere by anything. It means there are techniques using grazing you can benefit the species for basically that same reason that I already mentioned. They're coping with the new ecosystem. So I'm going to talk mostly about fire and livestock grazing interactions. Um, I'm calling it pyroherbivory today because somebody mentioned that there is now pyrosilviculture, where you use fire to manage forests. And so we're using fire to manage vegetation, which I think we can all agree that in many cases. I'm going to talk about the long-term impacts of grazing as a tool, the short-term impacts, and also integrated management using fire and grazing, although there's many other possibilities of using various kinds of tools together to manage vegetation. So we know we have a wildfire problem, right? So this is carbon emissions from wildfire in California. And I don't know how much people think about that, but the state was doing a pretty good job here, actually reducing its carbon emissions. Agriculture in general produces about 9% of emissions in the world, but our state was doing a pretty good job. This is their target level, and we were below it. But these wildfires in 2020, which I remember quite vividly, the time of plague and fires, lifted us way above our target uh, in those years. And the thing about fire is it doesn't happen every year, right? We've had a couple of years where it's been pretty low. Look at 2022. But when it happens, 2020 was unprecedented, 4 million acres burnt. But they tell us that that's likely to happen more often. So it's a problem in terms of emissions as well as just killing people and destroying property and everything else. And you can see 2020 was really fairly unprecedented. Now I go out in the field every so often, and sometimes there's firefighters around, and they will tell me that when they need to fight a fire, they look for places that are grazed because they have a chance there to stage their equipment to make a stand against a fire. You go into that forest, at that point, you're in trouble. But you get into a meadow that's been grazed or an open pasture, you have a chance. So that got me thinking about fire and grazing. And I got to get rid of these things. I don't know if you can see them or not, but I can. Um, One question I just want to start with is burning, prescribed burning, like prescribed grazing, are they interchangeable? Do they work the same way? Both of them remove fuels. Both of them uh, can't work if the vegetation is too woody. Fire, because it's dangerous to just set fire to a brush field, unless the situation is very special, and livestock because they can't eat a whole tree. They don't come with the kind of teeth. They're not porcupine. So that's one similarity or difference depending on how you look at it. But the most important thing I think that's different about them is selection. I don't know how many of you, when you have a plate of food in front of you, I don't know, there's two kinds of people in this world. Do you go around and take bites of each all the way through or kind of go back and forth? Or do you say, man, I like that asparagus, eat all of that, and then say, well, don't take carrots next. Do you eat one thing at a time, pretty much? Maybe taste and eat one thing at a time. I kind of was intrigued by, I think I would eat the asparagus first. Yeah. Or the peppers. Yeah, I love pepper. Okay. So there's livestock make the same kind of choices when they're out in the grassland. I know that predators pick one thing and then switch to another and then switch to another. When they run out of rabbits, they go for rats. At least that's what I was taught in wildlife management. But livestock or any grazing animal looks at the vegetation that's out there and they have to make a choice. What are they going to eat? They don't just randomly eat, they pick. Cattle are probably the least selective or the most selective, depending on how you look at it. But they each have their reasons, and the point is that they make a choice. Now, fire makes some choices, right? It burns dry things, it burns small things first. But that is a little different from saying, I like this species and I don't like that species. Or I'll go uphill, but I'd rather go downhill. Those kind of things that animals do are a little different. Fire likes to go uphill. Cattle don't. But anyway, selection. I just want to stay with selection, what they like. And that can be really useful if you understand what an animal prefers, what it will select, then it can be a real advantage. And if you're lucky for your particular site, an ecological site is the vegetation, the soils, the climate makes an ecological site. The NRCS provides them for most rangelands. So what particular species grow on that site? And you would probably go out if you were planning grazing, like at Richmond Field Station, you go out there and you see, oh, we have some native species. We have this blackberry that creeps across the ground. We have a lot of non-native species. And based on that, what are the preferences of the animals that are out there that I have a choice of? And so I wouldn't want to graze with something that I knew was going to pick native grasses first. I don't know of anything that actually does that, but if there were, that wouldn't be an animal I wanted to have. So there's a whole bunch of ways to manage grazing, standard ways. I mean, you can do your own. We call it the art of grazing management, based on selection, based on the plants that are out there, based on when you have an opportunity to graze and what kind of animals. But for example, for vernal pools, scientific studies have shown that year-round continuous grazing, not too many cattle, and this is with cattle, not too many cattle all the time, sort of hanging out there, actually do the most to select the non-native species. They prefer the non-native species to the rare and endangered species that are in vernal pools. So that makes it very useful. For invasive species, you might want to concentrate the animals on an area. You would never want to do that with a vernal pool. But for invasive species, high intensity rotation, some people call that the savory system, although you don't have to follow that system. You can just make it up based on what you know. High intensity rotation, which would be a disaster for vernal pools because it would mean that they would eat everything in their little area, including the endangered species. Or mob grazing, where you just bring on a bunch of animals at once for a short time. They eat everything, so they're going to eat the invasive, untasty species, even the ones they don't really want to select. So in the vernal pool case, you're maximizing their opportunity to select, and in the rotational grazing, you're minimizing it. And the average system used in California, Leslie Roche did this work, is low intensity, long-term rotational. You move from one pasture to another, maybe 4 months in one, 3 months in another, depending on how much feed they eat, um, depending on your goals, your management goals, or sometimes you go up to the mountains for part of the year. And then you manage the intensity, duration, basically the season, the frequency, the kind and age of animals. All those affect what's going to happen on the ground. And some people have always asked me, why can't we just use wildlife? Well, because we can't. Wildlife is great. Um, we can't put it on, take it off, increase the density of the animals, force them to eat things they don't want to eat, graze them at different seasons, more frequently or less frequently. We just can't do that with wildlife. So their impact on the vegetation is what it is. With the main way of managing the impacts of wildlife, like deer, is to hunt them when they get to be too intense. But we want to be more precise than that, right? And we want to be able to take animals off so that the plants can recover at different times. So this is first I'm going to talk about long-term grazing impacts. And the most interesting thing here is the impacts on brush encroachment. This is a picture of some photos that Felix Ratcliffe and I put together one night when we were talking on Zoom. Felix is a biologist at Rangeland Conservation consulting firm and a former student. So this is Wildcat Canyon, Contra Costa County, just over the hill, And this is what Wildcat Canyon looked like in 1939. And you can just look at this on Google Earth. There's this whole layer that SFEI donated to Google Earth, or they bought it or something. It's really fascinating. But you can see there's actually quite a bit more grassland in this picture. This is the North Slopes here, the North Slope, and it's actually going downhill. It's hard to see that, as is this. So the North Slope is always going to have more stuff on it and be wetter. So in Wildcat Canyon, this area is not grazed at all, the North Slope. But when you look at the grasslands, sometime after 1939, a fence was put in here to preserve the Tilden Nature Preserve, to keep it from the nefarious actions of grazing, to make it, I don't know, to save it. I want you to think about the fact that this new ecosystem or ecology or vegetation expression that's evolved here was probably something that hasn't been seen since the last little ice age, because as we know, our native residents were fairly avid burners. And the burning probably resulted more like the grazed landscape, with the oaks and a lot of the brush concentrated in the cool, moist swales where there's dry creeks or creeks, periodically inundated creeks. But the hillsides remained grassy, which of course supports elk and deer and healthy oaks that have a little more space and so on. So it made a lot of sense. But this is a new ecosystem, but it's the Tilden Nature Reserve. I think that's what it's called, and little farms down in there somewhere. And so you can see what happens when you have no vegetation management whatsoever in the Bay Area. And now the residents of Berkeley are having to do some pretty heartbreaking vegetation management around their homes, because they've got basically a firebomb over there. Brush burns very hot, burns very intensively because it's a bigger fuel. The fine fuels burn quickly. They start fires, the grasslands, but they're also, as long as there's not a high wind, pretty easy to put out. Once fire gets into some brush and really takes hold in a windy, hot situation, it becomes very difficult to put out until the wind stops or it rains. Okay, so that's just long-term. Grazing can suppress shrubs. Now, there's some things to know about that. One is that shrubs may or may not be palatable when they're mature. Cattle are not going to take out broom once it's grown. They're not going to take out even coyote brush, which are probably a lot of that is, Bacchus pilularius, when it's grown. It's just got time to be very woody and to bring out a lot of terpenes and other things that make it unpalatable. So goats would make some impact, but even they can't eat super, super woody vegetation. So with coyote brush anyway, we pretty much know that if you have cattle out there when it's seedlings, they're going to eat it. And that's true of a lot of shrubs. They will eat those seedlings. But once it gets bigger, they won't. A sheep too. So you have a window of opportunity to prevent shrub encroachment. After that, the window starts to close, and you should think about all those 4 million acres that burned in 2020 and what we're doing to keep them becoming huge flammable shrublands, because actually for maybe 50 years after a forest burns, without vegetation management, it's more flammable than it was before. So anyway, this is also an illustration why it's critical to know the animals and the plants. Managing grazing for fire management, shrub management, the site-specific activity. Can't just make huge sweeping generalizations. So here's an example, though, of a shrub that's like the leaves of the shrub are liked anytime. Deer brushes, Ceanothus indigeramus, really liked. And this is a forest plantation where grazing was introduced while it was still at the seedling stage. And you can see that outside this area where cattle were excluded, you just don't see it. There's a few, but you don't see that brush field effect. And this study was done because this retards the regrowth of the conifers on the site. If the grazing starts later, you can slow or suppress the growth of the shrubs. And so this little guy has been grazed for years, but he has a good start. And what you create is a lot of sprouts that benefit both the livestock and the deer. But the point is that you can't eradicate it. Maybe in this situation, it's a good thing because this shrub happens to fix nitrogen. So having some of it there is maybe good for the site. But in fact, deer brush is eaten when it's mature, by cattle anyway, and by sheep and goats. I'm sure they love it. But they don't completely get rid of it once it's grown up. And when it can get taller than a cow too. So they can't control it completely. They can reduce the amount of fine fuels, the leaves in it. This is an area near Bucks Lake that I drive through on the way to UC Forestry summer camp. And this burnt in 2020. And as you can see, this brush has really, really come back. And I don't think that is very conducive to management by cattle on any large scale, maybe some goats. I don't know the specific palatabilities of those plants. And once it gets bigger, it's not going to be very conducive to prescribed burning either, because that will take out whatever regenerating forest you have in there. It's a really interesting problem, but I'm just trying to make the point that it's better to start early than to wait years to do anything. Okay, so I've made these principles of shrub control, and a lot of it is based on this principle of selection and their preference for the target vegetation. So you should graze as soon as possible. After a fire or harvest, within a year is best. You need the right animal for local conditions, and there's differences between cows, sheep, and goats, including their preferences, their vulnerability to local predators like coyotes or now wolves. Of course, everything's vulnerable to them. Differences in cost and availability, planning, management issues and opportunities. Maybe you can't graze some places because it might harm an endangered species, or you want to graze someplace because it might benefit an endangered species. Some places are too steep, it might augment erosion, so forth. You need the right grazing system for your goals, and then you should consider integrated management, both grazing and prescribed burn in some situation. This is Briones, and on this side it's always been grazed, and this side always not, just as an illustration of the difference. I like fence line contrast. And of course, goats are really popular. They're much more appealing to people in residential areas than cows are. They're less scary, even though if you've ever had a goat, you should be terrified. I had some. They're hilarious. Oops, I wrote this in the wrong color. I'm sorry. But at the time I wrote this, it was about $2,500 per hectare. I think the East Bay Regional Parks are paying $2,000 or $3,000 an acre now, or it's really gotten expensive because this is how these people make their money. they are making their money from reducing vegetation, people who do this kind of grazing. They don't sell goats sometimes, but there's not a huge market for goat meat. These goats are not at optimum nutritional levels, so they're not going to make a lot of milk or produce a lot of baby goats. Um, it's challenging. They need to be hungry to eat some of the stuff that's out there, but that's expensive, and it should be, because it's costs a lot to just keep these animals for this. So, but they like shrubs better and eat more shrubs than cattle, and sheep are somewhere in between. So sheep tend to like broadleaf plants, so people use them a lot for that. But goats, you see them in little residential areas or around the edges of Briones, even though most of Briones is managed by cattle. In some specific areas where it's specifically brush, goats are used, or right up against houses. People like goats better. Um, okay, so that's long-term impacts with brush because they take a while to grow and they grow and they have certain specific things you need to remember. One is this window of opportunity, but also short-term annual management. Our grassland is on an annual cycle. It grows every year. So you need to remove, if you're really serious or worried about fire management, you need to reduce the fine fuels that are produced every year. And one way you can do that is with grazing animals. And so this is Hopland Field Station. It's mostly sheep that they graze there. To the right is an oak woodland. Um, the it was ungrazed. You can see that the fire was hot enough to damage the trees. We don't know how much until the next year, seeing how much they grow back. On the left, it was grazed. The fire, it was a good opportunity for the firefighters to make a stand there. And that side is where the fire stopped. That's Grazing makes it much easier to stop a fire if it's possible at all. And so this is Walnut Creek. This is one of my students measuring plants. And as you can see, they're low. And that's the goal of this kind of grazing, where you have grazing in areas. You've got a fire break there that's been disked. That is good for fire, not so great if you're trying to save some of the plants that are in there. But out here with grazing, they seldom, under normal grazing, will make a plant disappear. And they don't disturb the soil if they're properly managed, but they've significantly reduced the fine fuels. And right now this happens just as an accident by people who are grazing to raise livestock. They're going to raise livestock and they're going to sell those and make some income. So hopefully they can afford to pay the fees they pay to provide this service for us. And but if you took that and you said, hey, we want you to graze this place first, the other place second, we want you to hit the high priority areas for fire first, whether they're because they're likely to have fire or they're near residential areas, you can really significantly reduce fire hazard. And we don't do that enough. I have a site about that later. So short-term impacts, removing these fuels every year, and that's another advantage of grazing compared to prescribed burning, is that you can bring them on every year. And in fact, in a situation like this, of course, the parks bring them on every year. They make significant income from grazing, and do this, provide habitat and provide fuel reduction. In fact, some agencies, to avoid the whole controversy about grazing, have started to call these not grazing permits, but excess vegetation removal or disposal permits, which I find amusing but useful. I mean, that's really what they're doing. And the ranchers still pay. If what they are asked to do becomes more complex and contrary to the best interests of the animals, which can happen, or make it more costly to the rancher, then that has to change. So UCANR publications about this is just the impact of cattle grazing on California fine fuels. Without any intentionality to it. It's not targeted grazing, it's incidental grazing. They remove on 20 million acres. This study could only get data for 20 million acres. It probably graze around 30. They removed 11.6 billion pounds of fuel on average in 2017. So that's a lot of fine fuel, to almost 12 billion pounds. They reduce the reduction is enough to reduce the flame length, and change fire behavior so that it's easier to control. This paper is available. It's in California Agriculture. And if you want to write me for citations, I can send them to you. And then a study just came out, Napa and Sonoma counties, looking at grazing over several years and using modeling. They showed that the grazing of just incidental grazing of the grazable areas, the most grazable areas, reduced the annual burn probability by almost half, less than half the chance of fire, half of what the existing chance is. And then if you took those cattle and you put them in high priority CAL FIRE areas for fire and managed them for fire, you could reduce the probability of fire by 85%, which is pretty impressive. So there's a lot of potential for using grazing for fire reduction that is not being realized. Now, when I teach my class, I like to teach them about the different animals, and I say the hoovers, the vacuum cleaners of the cows are really good for large areas where the main target is grass, and I've showed enough pictures of them. So I think sheep are sort of like a hand vac. They're more precise. They have smaller mouths, and they pick and choose a little more, and they like more broadleaf plants. This is a picture of sheep going to work near the village in Spain that I've been in for the last week. They've invested a lot in clearing the forest undergrowth near the highway, and you're seeing that being done in California more and more. But sometimes it's prescribed burning. Here it's just, they don't really do much prescribed burning in Spain, even though they have the same problems we do in the same grass. They, after they cleared the shrubs, then they bring in the sheep to manage the grass, and they'll be grazing there every year to do that. And this is Briones, the pruning shears. The goats, since they like shrubs, I think of them as the pruning shears. And of course, there's a lot of overlap. Goats eat grass, sheep eat grass. Goats did a really good job. I had some for 15 years in my backyard. They ate the grass down really well, and all the shrubs and our neighbor shrubs, and they just rotated around our neighborhood, doing their job, doing what they liked best, which was eating. So targeted grazing. So you could think of it as a spectrum of a few things. One is grassy vegetation versus woody. You tend to find goats on this side and cows on the other. If it's a large area and open land, cattle are by far the most economical to use. It doesn't take that many cows. It takes 5 times as many goats or sheep to graze as much as a cow. So you need a lot more. And frankly, there aren't very many in California, sheep and goats. We haven't had a market for goat meat for a long time. We're just starting to get more goats to do some of this job. But they are a little more expensive. But smaller areas near development, goats are extremely effective. Woodier landscapes, because they are more attracted to shrubs. I had sheep and then I had goats, and I couldn't believe the difference. The goats would just zoom in on shrubs, including oaks. They just zoom in on. So this is a random company, but it just is how they're characterized. They make money from grazing. That's how they're making their income. And apparently here they sell goats too. But you can see what the goats do to the shrubs. If the woody vegetation, the stems are larger, they don't eat the stems, but they take everything off of them that's smaller. They have a limit. If you're eating some kinds of food, vegetables, when a vegetable gets to a certain amount of woodiness, you're not going to eat it like a monster carrot. You want them to be relatively tender. The same is true of all these grazing animals. So they're going to leave those stems behind, but they will reduce the fine fuels quite a lot. And that's another reason why it's nice to start before the stems get that big. This is an illustration from Spain of using livestock to manage vegetation. And so they want these oaks to grow tall and straight and spread out. They do a lot of cork oaks. So here's how you would use livestock, both to clear the grass, but also to make the oaks grow straighter and taller and get rid of the root sprouts, as they think of them. And then we've got a lizard and a snake. That helps too. The author was showing how this is very biodiverse and green management. It's kind of a cool book. So The last technique, what I'm going to talk about is integrated management, prescribed fire plus prescribed grazing. There are so many tools, even herbicides that you can use with grazing or with fire, you can mix and match. But if after burning, uh, grazing can really maintain a burn much longer than it would last. They can keep the impacts, the clearing impacts, they can keep it open longer because a burnt shrub is like a new shrub. It's much easier to graze. Even if you don't kill the shrub, the new sprouts that come up, very tender, like asparagus, very good, very nutritious, and the animals are attracted to it. You know, the natives, Americans of the prairies, um, Great Prairie, um, used to attract wildlife. You know, we've always wondered, why do we have this huge tall grass prairie? They used to burn a lot, and it would attract wildlife to areas that have been burned. Kept out the trees too that are coming back in now. It's a reset of the vegetation back to zero. But before burning, you saw those stems that the goats left. The fine fuels, really flammable fine fuels that carry a fire around like grass, and the leaves of the shrubs have been reduced. So it's not going to burn as much. But with fire, you can remove those woody stems and clear the vegetation entirely after grazing. And ranchers have always been avid burners in California. They love it, and it's a sore point with them that they've been stopped from doing a lot of burning. Cal Fire's finally opening up, so it's become easier. But communities will get together and make these prescribed burn associations and go from property to property because it really does improve the pastures and maintain a relatively fire-free landscape. I talked to a guy who said that his aunt decided she wasn't going to have grazing around her part of the ranch. And in 2020, everything burned, including the part that she'd protected from grazing. And so now she's an avid grazing fan because it was very close to her house. So vegetation management in California, in 2020, we burnt more than 4 million acres. That's not going to happen every year, but it looks really impressive. So I have it there. We have this collaborative project with the federal government to thin some of our forests. Its target is 1 million per acres per year. I don't think we've caught that target yet. It's hard to thin a forest. It's really expensive. There's a lot of environmental reasons why it's hard. So that's one thing that's going on. Prescribed and controlled burning is around 100,000 acres. It's changing because we're trying to do more, and more power to the prescribed burners. That's great. But it's also tricky. You know, we don't encourage our graduate students. They only have 5 or 6 years to do their PhDs, and to study prescribed burning means they have to actually happen. In too many years, it's been hard to have the right weather at the right time. So sometimes that's hard. And wildlands anyway. Goats around 100,000 acres a year, probably less. Cattle grazing, gosh, cattle are grazing 20 million acres a year. And most of the time they're paying for the privilege. There's about 2 million cattle. It's really quite down, and probably down more because of the droughts, also because cattle prices are really high. So people are selling their animals to take advantage of this high prices. So our cattle numbers are declining. But as I said, 12 billion pounds of fuels removed each year. And this is an interesting article that I gave you the citation earlier on the slides. And you see, Agriculture and Natural Resources Cooperative Extension has just put out this very nice document about expanding prescribed burning for wildfire resilience in California. So I think it's really good. It talks about all 3 of these animals, does a good job. So there's the link. I can send it to you too if you lose track of it, but probably if you just remembered the title and Googled it, you'd be able to find it these days. So with that, I wanted to show you some fun things from Spain since I just got back. In the area where I was, their goat cheese is really famous. So most of the grazing was goats. And the first thing we saw is this guy taking his goats out. This will be relevant, I promise. But the last animal in his herd was this deer that's been following this goat herd since it was a fawn and basically living with it. I thought that was amazing. This is the town I'm in. And it's very interesting. A guy named Steve Pine. Is he related to you, Bob? Anyway, Steve Pine, it's Pyne in this case. He wrote this book about fire in Europe, and it's really interesting. Apparently, Rome burned all the time because it's Mediterranean, like our vegetation. But anyway, like our climate. So this little town has about little less than 2,000 people in it, or around 2,000 people in it. Fire tends to come from this direction, from the lower left-hand corner of the page. And not only is this fortified here against uh, pirates, which was a big deal in those days, a while back, it's fortified and it's a ways. It's a bit of a ways from Gibraltar. So it's pretty far inland, but it's fortified against all kinds of military attack. But in the direction that fire is likely to come from, it's also heavily grazed by goats, and there's some cattle and there's some sheep. In fact, the most famous sheep is a mix of sheep and goat cheese. So that's interesting. If you look out from the village, and I apologize for this weird new construction, but if you're standing up on the cliff and you're looking down, you can see that the fire path, the path that the hot winds come from, we have the Diablos, they have something else that comes from this direction in the summer, is where the most vegetation has been reduced. That has grown in more than it used to. They've got a lot more vegetation than they did 200 years ago, just like us. But it's still, you can still see the patterns on the landscape and also in the housing, because this is what the interior of a town like this looks like, as opposed to having, it's kind of what they recommend after the fires in Pacific Palisades, right? No vegetation anywhere near your house. So you have to believe, as Stephen Pine does, that there's some fire wisdom afoot in these villages. Also, my last example comes from the marine world. I went to this talk by a marine biologist, and they were giving a talk. Maybe, I don't remember why, and I thought, well, what do I know about marine biology? But he showed this picture of a reef, tropical reef, and all of these fish that you see are eating plants. They're herbivores. And this is what it looks like when there's full on grazing. You've got a healthy reef and a lot of grazing. And then he showed what happens when you lose the grazers. And a lot of California, in our case, it's not only the loss of grazers, it's the loss of fire, right? A lot of California, to my mind, looks like this today. Unlikely to be a fire thing underwater, but I don't know. I thought that was pretty cool and pretty interesting illustration. Not cool. This is bad, 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 bad. This is more biodiversity, which you get with grazing above ground, above water too, appropriate grazing. So I'll leave you with that, and just one other thing, site specific always. So thank you very much.